Have you ever been told that you're too much or that you're being too sensitive? Do things ever feel really overwhelming to you? Maybe you have heard of this trait called the HSP or highly sensitive person, but it is a thing. And Dr. Dana Basu is going to go into detail about what this experience is like and how to work with clients that are HSPs. She's got so many great things to share here. I hope you'll have a listen and let us know in the comments below what any takeaways are. My name is Emily Salas. I am the host for the Sage Holistic Show, and I'm so glad that you found us.
Sage is a 501c3 nonprofit organization building community by providing education and counseling about physical, mental, and spiritual well-being. We encourage all of our listeners to find their own path to what holistic wellness means to you.
My presentation is supposed to be on the highly sensitive client. And I guess I'm just curious who has heard the term highly sensitive person and who maybe identifies with that term. So this is one of the great things about presenting to a group of healers is that I imagine that everybody's encountered this either within themselves or with their clients. So I'm hoping that this is helpful for you guys. For those of you who don't know much about it, highly sensitive person, or sometimes it's referred to as an HSP, that's the lingo. It's about 15 to 20% of the population. So you are not alone. You are one of many if this is you. And I think one of the things that's really useful for HSPs is to know many times they've grown up feeling, what's wrong with me? Why am I so different? Why is everybody else not like me? Why can't I fit in? So, 80% of the population isn't like them. And we also live in this larger culture that devalues those highly sensitive qualities. And so there is a lot of shame and guilt and stuff that we often carry around with us because of that. And so oftentimes your clients may kind of bring that with them into their work with you. But it's a normal variation of temperament. It is not a diagnosis. It is not a problem. It is a normal part of humankind, but also what I think is really interesting is they've also found it in animal populations. So I think that sort of speaks to the evolutionary purpose of this temperamental trait. There's equal men and women who are highly sensitive, and there's more introverts than extroverts, but there still are extroverted, highly sensitive people. So that can often be kind of confused. How can you be highly sensitive and an extrovert? But they are not synonyms. So Elaine Aron, who is like the guru of HSPs, she's sort of coined the term and did tons of research, has produced wonderful, wonderful books. But she sort of organized these traits into four qualities, and she used the acronym DOES as a helpful reminder of these four qualities that make up an HSP. Typically, when somebody hears the idea of highly sensitive, what comes to mind is, oh, you cry a lot, or you're very emotional. That's the mentality, but that's just one of four aspects. So the four aspects are, the D is the depth of processing. The O is overstimulation. The E is for the emotional intensity and sensitivity. And the S is for sensitivity to subtlety. I'm going to go into each of those so we have a better understanding of that. The depth of processing speaks to just this craving for depth that HSPs have. We like to dive in deep. We like to explore those inner darker corners that we maybe, it's fascinating for a lot of us, even if sometimes it's painful. But there's something so rewarding about it. HSPs tend to be very creative and, come up with so many different ideas and unique ideas. So there's so many benefits to this depth of processing, but there's also challenges that come along with it. In relationships, some of the benefits is that people really tend to enjoy being around HSPs. They sort of feel filled up, I think, a lot of times by being around HSPs. But the danger, or like the challenge for HSPs is they sometimes find themselves in one-sided relationships where they're giving and not receiving. They can sort of feel like they're the pseudo therapist for their friends, where they're the go-to person for all the problems. And so they can also just end up feeling very drained, very like I'm giving and I'm not getting. And then decision making is another area where that depth can sometimes cause some problems, because we like to think about all the things. And so when you actually need to make a decision, that can make it hard, because you're like, well, what if this, and what if this, and the da-da-da-da, and it's hard to just remember, okay, I gotta hone it in and I gotta like come up with a decision and then move on. So that's one of the other challenges that can come up with that. Some of the helpful interventions for HSPs is using some of the cognitive challenging, because they tend to do a lot of, well, what if this, what if that, if this happens, then this could happen. And so really helping them to say, okay, well, how important is that if that thing happens? Is it worth it to spend this mental energy going down all of these rabbit holes? And what is the most likely outcome? So let's go with that. Let's kind of narrow down these possibilities. We've done all of the broad thinking, but now we got to narrow it down into the most likely outcome to make some of our decisions and move forward and not be stuck. And then the other thing that can be really helpful for HSPs with that depth of processing is distress tolerance. Feeling like there's so much coming up at you, it can make you feel really activated. It can make you feel really stressed out. So building those skills where, okay, I'm having this feeling and it's really uncomfortable, but just because I have a feeling doesn't mean I have to be overwhelmed by that feeling. There's things I can do to take down that intensity, not maybe erase the feeling, but just take down that intensity to make it a more manageable level. So then the second piece of the DOES acronym is moving into overstimulation. This is the area where HSPs tend to have the most challenges, because if you're this sensitive person, this sponge, and you're kind of absorbing all the things in the world, you're gonna get overstimulated, and it's gonna happen probably quite a lot. So all HSPs feel this overstimulation, but how they feel it can be very different. So overstimulation happens a lot around those sensory experiences. So the things that we're seeing, what we're hearing, the touch and the feeling. This can be like a really common thing for parents when you have like little ones tugging on your clothing and like spinning around in your lap. Smells can be really overpowering and overwhelming. Taste can be like so intense that it just feels really difficult. So those sensory pieces, but also things like crowds, having timelines, multitasking, having to do so many things at once. It can feel like your brain is like being pulled into so many different directions, because we want to go into that one thing and do it really well, And so when we're being pulled into so many different things, we can't do it really well. And so experience is very stressful. So I have sort of 4 helpful tips for working with that overstimulation. One is implementing a daily relaxation practice. So this is sort of our prevention, because if we wake up in the morning and we just go at it, and we wake up at maybe a 6, like on that intensity scale, that SUD scale, and something happens and we go up to a 7, and then something else happens and we go up to an 8, we're already 2 points. We've just moved up to this place of pretty close to being overwhelmed just right away in our morning. So if we can instead wake up and we're at a 6 and we do some sort of practice that brings us down to even a 4, it just builds that window for us so we have more wiggle room, so we don't reach that place of overwhelm so quickly. This is a really, really important practice. The second recommendation is learning to find ways to reduce stimulation. And so that's really like learning yourself or your client. What is it that is causing that stimulation for you? Is it sound? Is it sight? Is it what's going on with touch? And not only like this general idea of sight or sound or touch or multitasking, but specifically, I wish I could show you my screen, but like I came up with all these different ways. I don't know if you can see this, but like these are all the different ideas of like how smell can be overwhelming. These are all the different ways of how sight can be overwhelming, all the different ways how touch can be overwhelming. Sound, there's a lot there because that's me. So I related to that one more. But taste, and then just all, there's just so many different ways that it can show up. So it's not going to show up the same for every HSP, but it's going to show up. So it's figuring out where is it for you, where is it for your client, and what can I do about it? So for me, sound is my biggest trigger. And so I am very thoughtful about, okay, this one, so somebody has a TV on downstairs. So I'm upstairs, I'm going to close my door so I don't hear that sound. Or I'm going to put in noise canceling headphones if I need quiet, or I'm going to ask, can you put your headphones on so I don't have to hear that? And that brings me to like the third recommendation, which is setting boundaries, because nobody does well when you as an HSP or your client as an HSP gets to that place of overwhelmed. And so the more that they can learn to advocate for themselves, ask for what they need, the better everybody around them is. So it might be saying, hey partner, I'm feeling like I've got too much going on in my brain and this noise from the TV is really hard for me to hear. Could you watch it in a different room, or could you put it on the iPad and wear your headphones, or anything like that? So really kind of standing up and asserting and trying to problem solve in that way. And then the last thing is sort of like the last resort. If we get to this place where we are in this overwhelmed state because of all the sensory information, it's using those coping skills to reduce that stress. So it might be just some mindfulness. What is going on with me? Where am I feeling this? Might be some deep breathing, anything that we know to relax the body and de-stress the body. Those are where those skills are going to fall into place. Are we with me so far? Yes? Okay. So we're moving from the D to the O, and now we're at the E in the DOES acronym, and that's the emotional intensity, emotional sensitivity. Like I said before, this is the thing that people kind of identify as being part of the HSP persona. But it makes so much sense, because if you can't be more aware of what's going on around you and not have more feelings about it, or more deeper feelings about it. So of course, HSPs are going to have more emotions. Of course, HSPs are going to have more intensity there. But this there's this spectrum, right? Because it's the negative. Yes, we're going to have more intense negative emotions. We're going to feel the sadness more. We're going to feel the grief more. We're also going to feel the joy more. We're going to feel the satisfaction more. And so recognizing that, I think a lot of HSPs sort of look at this side of the spectrum and lament, oh my gosh, why am I this way? I have such a burden that I'm carrying because I am this way. But let's look at this side too. What are the gifts? What is it that you get to appreciate that maybe people around you don't have that same satisfaction around, because you just feel it deeper. It goes to your core maybe a little bit more. The other thing that I find a lot here is that cultural messages and family messages around emotions are really impactful. We live in a larger culture where emotions are devalued. And not everybody, but some HSPs grow up in families where emotions are devalued, or because HSPs present as more emotional, families aren't equipped to respond to that level of emotion. And so they get stressed, they get frustrated, which ends up being very shaming for the HSP. So being able to sort of step back from that mindset that HSPs are often sort of ingrained and recognize, what is the role here of emotions? Why do we have them? There's a purpose here. There's a reason for these emotions here. Let's pay attention to them. Let's listen to what they have to say to us, and let's utilize them. You have this gift that is giving you more information, a little bit more internal wisdom than maybe the average person, and let's use it. So it's about talking about those emotions in a different way. And then the last thing is the sensitivity to subtlety. It's the thing about us that we notice the details. We notice the subtleties. This can happen in physical environments. So, like my daughter is an HSP, and so sometimes she'll walk in downstairs and I'll have tried to hide something that I didn't want her to see, and she'll be like, "Oh, what is that little thing poking up from that shelf there?" And I can just see that little red thing, and I'm like, "Of course you noticed that." Yeah. So it's just like picking up. It's like there's this uncanny ability to zone in or hone in on these details that some other person is going to walk into the room and be like, "What are you talking about? I don't see anything different." So it can be in the physical environment. It can be in the relational environment. This is where we pick up on those emotional and facial cues, that body language. And this is where, especially for HSPs who have a trauma history, or especially a developmental trauma history, that can lead us to spin. Oh my gosh, why are you upset? Are you upset at me? What did I do? Because you're picking up on all these details. So yes, that's the HSP part, but the trauma part is where it can kind of really interact and make that feel even more scary and overwhelming in and of itself. So I think this is sort of the component that connects to all the other components. We can't process things deeply. We can't be overstimulated by things. We can't have emotions about things unless we notice them. And so this is where I think this is sort of like the bridge between all these other three characteristics. It's this noticing. Not necessarily that we have better senses. There can be a blind HSP, there can be a deaf HSP. It's not the senses itself, it's the processing of that information, right? So why are you more likely to work with HSPs? There's three reasons I think that you're more likely to work with HSPs. And the first one is that HSPs are more likely to be impacted by a trauma. This is because we feel it more, right? We're more aware of what's happening. We process it more intensely. So there's a bigger impact. So there's more of a severity of impact. Second thing is we're more likely to experience the trauma of emotional invalidation because of that disconnect between how we are in the world and the culture, especially like our parents' generation, where those messages were so stifling, like don't feel, don't, have all of these wonderful emotions. And so there's this added shame of, well, what's wrong with me? Why am I different? Why can't I fit in like my brothers or my sisters or my friends in the same way? And then the third thing is that HSPs like self-discovery and self-growth. And so there's this draw to all of you to learn more about themselves, to grow, and to just keep learning. And I think that's a beautiful thing. And so what do HSPs need from you? They need a non-pathologizing way of understanding their HSP self. This isn't about pathology. This is just about ingrained genetics, temperament. You need an emotionally supportive environment that supports and embraces those qualities about them instead of making that something negative. They need you to believe in their own inner wisdom to help them connect to all of that information that they have and utilize it. And then they need your help to cope with their unique challenges because they're there and they are difficult. But if we can find the right way to cope with them, then we can really benefit from the benefits and mitigate those challenges. All right, that's a lot. So any questions? Yeah, Emily.
Hi, thank you so much for that.
Yeah.
I have two questions. The first, and I think you may have kind of answered it towards the end there, but are HSPs typically, is it believed that they're born or bred?
Born.
Okay. And is it like once an HSP, always an HSP?
Yes. Yeah.
All right. Well, that was a
Yeah.
great presentation. So thank you so much.
It was awesome. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
I just imagine that there's probably a lot of misdiagnoses with other disorders. I'm imagining just kids with who are HSPs, but they're diagnosed autism and, not given ABA, getting confused, and maybe not resonating with those interventions. I was just wondering if there's any other common diagnoses that, as a therapist, I should be looking out for to kind of rule, make sure I consider HSP when I'm doing, diagnosing clients and everything.
Autism is one of them that is a misdiagnosis. But there's also overlap. Like there you can be both an HSP and have autism. As with any mental health disorder, you can have both. I'm trying to think. The tricky thing is
I was also kind of thinking with ADHD, I have ADHD, but I'm more inattentive. And so sometimes with I don't know, I was resonating when you said just hearing noises and stuff like that. If that, I see that going hand in hand with there's maybe that could be a common code. I know it's not a diagnosis, but thing
occurring. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think the tricky thing is that you can be an HSP and you can have another diagnosis on top of that. But I would say what's really helpful is to, before you go to the diagnosis, let's look at, okay, so you've got the overstimulation piece, right? Do you have these other qualities of HSP that might be enough to explain what's going on? Or does it feel like, yes, that is true, but it seems more so? Or no, they don't have these other qualities. It's just this one area. It's just the O of the DOES acronym. And so that can kind of be helpful in teasing apart. Yeah. Sensory processing disorders, I think, are another one that can be kind of misdiagnosed. But I've actually run into a lot of people in my personal life where they are really, really struggling with their kids and they can't make sense of their behaviors. And then for whatever reason, I start talking about what I do. And they're like, well, tell me about this HSP thing. And I start describing and they're like, oh my God, that explains my child. And there's like these light bulbs that go off. And I also see like so much relief just having a way of conceptualizing what's going on. If you can conceptualize it, respond to it. When we're like lost in uncertainty, I don't know why this is happening. It's so hard to feel grounded in our responses. So the Elaine Aron book, The Highly Sensitive Child, is very, very helpful for parents who are struggling with kids who just don't seem to fit any specific. They've seen the pediatricians, they've seen the therapist, and they can't quite make sense of what's going on. I've had a lot of kids who kind of get put into that HSP framework, and things just click into place. Okay, now I understand why she's losing it at the end of the school day because she's so overstimulated. Or now I understand why her brain is kind of going like, what if, because this is just part of her makeup. And so we can teach her how to cope with it, because that's the thing we can do is like, if this is going to be a lifelong part of ourselves, we want to learn how to, make the most of it and cope with the challenging parts and embrace the gifts of it.
I'm wondering too, you ever done any, is there overlap or anything with like preemie babies or babies, difficult pregnancies or anything? Has there been any correlation that you've seen with that?
I don't know the answer to that question, but because it's a genetic based temperamental trait, my gut is saying preemie or not, it's not going to impact HSP. Typically, you can trace it in families. So you can look at a child and then the child can be like, well, I got it from my mom. And then the mom will be like, well, like if I look at my own family history, my child is this HSP. I learned about HSP from trying to understand her. I'm like, oh my gosh, that's me. And then I'm trying to think, where did it come from in my family? My family wasn't very emotional. They didn't have that kind of framework. But now that I look back and I'm like, oh, that's my mom. It was just how she responded to being this HSP in this very constricting culture that she was raised in. And so it's not always as obvious, but there's if you go back to the DOES acronym, you can usually kind of like fit little pieces of information into each of those categories that you're like, okay, that makes sense.
Do you find too that it's impacted by attachment styles then?
Yes.
Your history?
Yes, attachment has such a profound impact on HSPs because we are impacted by our environment. And so I wish I could have shown you this slide because I made this graph to show that, because if we are raised by good enough parenting, HSPs tend to excel. They do better than non-HSPs. Even with mediocre parenting, they tend to do better. When they have inadequate parenting, they do worse because they are so much more impacted by that harm. So I think that's the reality, and there's some, disappointing, that's hard to swallow when you've got a kiddo who has not great attachment figures, but there's also hope because we also know that we can work on attachment if parents are willing, depending on what we got.
Thank you for spending some of your time today with us at Sage Holistic Health and Wellness Center. If you like what we're all about, please consider supporting our nonprofit organization by making a tax-deductible donation. To do this, you can go to our website at www.sagewellnessctr.org and click on Donate in the upper right-hand corner. We look forward to spending some time again with you real soon. Take good care.